At any rate, uh, this was the job that my mother had. My father, in the meantime, was the editor of a Swedish language newspaper, and it was because Sweden was in the midst of becoming a social democracy. This was something that interested my father very much, and so he joined the Swedish Socialist Party in Chicago and was editor of their paper. Mrs. Lyon, on the other hand, was extremely conservative, and so I don't think she thought this was a good match for my mother. But that didn't convince my mother that she had the wrong man. She knew she had the right fellow. So in 1914, they were married, and at that time, the two of them went to Sweden on their honeymoon. That was the first time they had gotten back to Sweden, 7 years later after they had come. And when they came back, they found an apartment on Clark Street in Chicago.
So what did they say what they did in Sweden?
What?
Did they say what they did in Sweden?
Well, they just were visiting family when they were in Sweden. But it was 1914, and while they were there, the war broke out in Europe. And of course, my father got word from the newspaper in Chicago that they needed him back. My mother was not ready to leave so quickly, but he had to go back, and she stayed. And I don't know how long she stayed, but I think when she did come back, her sister and her brother came along with her. There were 7 children in both families, both my father's and my mother's family. So now 3 of them were coming to America, and everybody came to Chicago. And my parents had this apartment on Clark Street, and that's where I grew up. And because they loved the Swedish language, they had me learn Swedish before I learned English. And I've been eternally grateful for that. But since we were right in the middle of the city, my playmates were Americans. So while I learned Swedish, I learned English. So I was bilingual as I was growing up. By the time I went to school, I was able to speak both English and Swedish. And at any rate, I did have playmates. I had a little boy by the name of Billy Gronefeld. He and I were the best of friends. And when I was probably about 2 or 3 years old, Mrs. Lyon and her husband were beginning to have a few problems and realizing maybe this marriage wasn't going to work. So they gave up their apartment and they moved in with my parents, of all things, and lived with my folks for a while. And I must have been 2 or 3 years old. It couldn't have been a very easy time for my folks because my mother had to have Irish linen tablecloths on the table for meals, and she must have worked awfully hard to take care of these 2 families. And Mrs. Lyon was a strict disciplinarian, and I grew up with the idea that there was no monkey business when she was around. I knew what that meant. But I did respect her, and I knew that she really thought an awful lot of me. She had no children of her own, so I always became like a second child to her. She was really very good to me. But her husband, in turn, while they were living with us, I remember the one experience, the first and only time I think I went to the circus. He took Billy Gronefeld and myself to the circus, and that was a big occasion to see this big Ringling Brothers circus in Chicago. And I know the one thing Billy Gronefeld wanted was Jack or Crack. He couldn't say Cracker Jack, so he wanted Jack or Crack. Now, let's see, what else was I going to talk about? Well, uh, we lived across. By the way, when I was born, we lived across the street from one of the biggest cemeteries in Chicago, and this was 1918, the year of the flu the international flu epidemic. And there were funerals day and night, my mother could see, so she was so worried she didn't think I would live through this. But she must have taken awfully good care of me because all three of us survived. Uh, Finally, after 5 years, I guess it was, we lived there. I was 5 years old when my Aunt Elsie got married, and the two couples decided to buy a house together. So then we moved from Clark Street to Somerdale Avenues, where we bought this house together and lived together. And I we had to walk. Well, let's see.
Just,
I was forgetting what I was going to